All right, so I'm Chelsea Sanchez. I'm a second-year pediatric resident here on my adolescent rotation, and I decided to do my presentation for this block on alcohol and the adolescent brain. So this presentation will dive into alcohol as well as a couple of different aspects of substance abuse and addiction. So to start off, just talking about the brain. So the old theory of thought was that the brain developed until about age 3, but in the more recent years, we've come to know that it develops far into the early 20s. So things that I'm going to talk about in this presentation, a couple aspects of the brain. So in this table, there's a couple different areas of the brain. So the frontal lobe we'll talk about a lot, which is the function is the self-control, judgment, and emotional regulation. This is actually restructured in the teen years. So obviously it exists in the younger years, but is restructured. I'll go into a lot about that. The corpus callosum it functions for intelligence, consciousness, and self-awareness. That comes to full maturity in the 20s. We have the parietal lobes, which speaks to the integration in auditory, visual, and tactile signals. That is immature until about age 16. And then the temporal lobes function for emotional maturity, and that is still developing around or after age 16. I also talk about a couple other aspects of the brain, but I'll explain them when I get there. So just to dive right into what happens with the brain in adolescence. So one of the big things that happens is pruning and myelination. So pruning is basically when you're born, you have multiple neurons that are formed, and they just keep forming and keep forming. But as we get to the adolescent years, remodeling occurs. So the brain kind of takes a step back and prunes off the things that we don't need as much of, and starts building up the areas that are being used more often. So basically, the brain is being remodeled for adult behaviors. Some areas that they have seen through like MRIs and things like that, you can see that there's areas diminishing by about 50% during adolescence, whereas other areas become a lot thicker and more active, all due to this process. So if you think about it, areas that are getting attention will basically survive and become stronger. So if the areas of the brain that are activated by alcohol, so if the teenagers are indulging in things like that, those areas will become stronger and basically, in a sense, become primed for addiction. So this slide talks about what you can see with that pruning. So kind of at the top of this picture, you can see the brain at about 3 months of age and how it's really thick with that gray area. And as you proceed to the right and then kind of back to the left and down towards the 18 years, you can see that there's much more white matter. And specifically, this slide talks about the frontal brain, the frontal cortex. So thinning in the early years is more so for the sensory and the motor areas of the brain. So if you think about kids developing their developmental milestones, those are the areas that are being focused and groomed. And then as they mature, things in the frontal area, so those areas of behavior and inhibition, are being more focused on. So what we see is a delayed maturation of the frontal regions are evident in terms of cortical thinning. So you can see they're thicker at that top corner, whereas they're thinner kind of towards the middle on the left. On the right. And what we see if you did a functional MRI is that the adolescent brain switches from more of a diffuse activation when we look at tasks requiring inhibitory self-control. So when they're having to inhibit their brain, so that switches from a diffuse activation to a more focal activation, which is exactly what the pictures are kind of correlating with. Another thing that was mentioned in one of the papers that I was reading is that we, as adults, use a kind of a top-down control system. So we think through things. If you think of the brain and the brain stem itself is the kind of what is the word? The kind of instinctive functions. So rather than working from those instinctive functions up, we work from the top down. So adolescents are still working on kind of controlling that bottom up system. So the amygdala and the instinctive areas of the brain are highly responsive to the rewarding stimuli, and they're working through becoming more of the top down thought process. So that's why they're so kind of, they jump into things very quickly and are very impulsive, or can be. So the reward system, I just kind of mentioned the amygdala. So that is an area of the brain that modulates social, aversive, and emotional stimuli. And there's the area called the ventral striatum that actually changes in response to dopamine, which is a hormone or a neurotransmitter that is brought out by things that are going to make you feel good. So if we think of the reward circuit as critical for seeking and consuming the survival essential things. So if we're thinking of food, water, warmth, procreation, those kind of things, those are tapped in by novel stimuli, so things that kind of get you going, exciting and risky situations, and then alcohol, nicotine, and other drugs have been found to tap into that survival mode too. So what was interesting is one of the papers talks about that with repeated alcohol use, the brain's natural capacity to produce dopamine is reduced because we're producing it by, we have to kind of stimulate it with the alcohol and other things. So they're on this kind of high alert. And when they don't have the alcohol there to stimulate it, the brain is, like I just said, not producing it. So they elicit feelings of depression, anger, boredom, anxiety, which makes them seek that feeling again. So they'll go back to using whatever it was. So risk-taking and why they do it. So if you think about tendencies for risk-taking, sensation-seeking, alcohol, drug use are influenced by their immature cognitive control capacity. So they're still using that bottom-up approach. They can be overwhelmed by enhancing reactivity to the social and emotional stimuli. So basically, they have enhanced responses to social and emotional stimuli, whereas the next bullet, they have attenuated or slow reactivity to aversive stimuli. So they kind of want that instant gratification, and where they feel that is when they get social and emotional stimuli. And so I kind of pulled this quote out from one of the papers by Dr. Linda Spear, who wrote a paper in 2012 on adolescent neurodevelopment, saying that attenuated aversive consequences in the face of a potential for greater rewarding benefits could combine with genetic and environmental risk factors to promote high levels of reward consumption, leading to problematic involvements with alcohol, other drugs, and other rewarding or risky stimuli. Which is just fancier ways of saying what I've kind of already said. So why do they pick alcohol? Why is this something that they turn to? So looking at emotional satisfaction from drinking, young drinkers want to feel different when they drink. So they're looking for the next thing to kind of make them feel different, make them feel grown up. So in a survey that they did among teenagers, they had asked why they drink. And so these are the top 5. So to relax and lower their inhibitions in social situations, they have this tendency to think that everybody's looking at them. So if they have something in their system that they think will relax and lower their inhibitions, they feel more comfortable. To reduce stress, tension, and worries, to increase their courage and feelings of power, those 3 kind of go together, to enhance their sexual attractiveness and performance, or they think that's what's going to happen, and to satisfy their curiosity about the feelings that alcohol produces, or to feel more grown up. And I didn't go into it, but there's a ton of information on how the media influences teen risky behavior. So there's just an ad there of kind of what they're exposed to. So if we look at alcohol, the age of drinking continues to become lower. So the picture on here is of babies hopefully not drinking alcohol, but obviously they don't start that young. The graph on the right-hand side, you can see that at age 12 is where we're starting to see early discussions of alcohol and where they're trying alcohol. And then you see a great increase from age 12 to about age 18 is the steepest slope there. And what you'll see is that males and females really are, neck and neck in how they're trying it. So it's not necessarily by gender, but it is obviously an increasing issue in the high school age kids. So if we look at alcohol's effects on the brains, in a study looking at brains in kids aged 14 to 21, from teens who used alcohol and those who didn't, they looked at the hippocampus. So I didn't mention this in that first table, but it's an area of the brain that focuses on memory and learning. And they found that the hippocampus in the teens who drank was 10% smaller. So if you can imagine, if that's the area of the brain that handles memory, then it's going to be affecting how they learn in school. The next broad point about, so it continues to talk about the hippocampus, where they're having issues forming new, lasting, and explicit memories, and then which has the implications for learning and academic performance. The last part is about the prefrontal cortex. So there was initially a thought that the prefrontal cortex, which is supposed to be growing and being pruned and all of that, is smaller across the board in men or in females and males when they drink. But this study by Medina, done in 2008, had actually seen that comparing girls who drink to girls who don't drink, their prefrontal cortex is smaller, but from boys who drink and those who don't, theirs is actually bigger. So is it that their brain is actually, the boys' brains are bigger by about 3%, but or is it that the girls have already matured and so their brains are rather than continuing to grow as the boys do, their brains are being inhibited. So the girls who drink may have a bigger impact on their lives. Myelination is something I talked about before with the pruning aspect. So myelination helps stabilize and speed up the brain processes. So if you look at the pictures, there's gray matter and white matter, and the white matter is what's been myelinated or kind of covered in that insulation. So alcohol has toxic effects on that myelination process. So it's rather than encouraging the neurons or the brain cells to be insulated and make connections faster, we're destroying that myelination, so they're having issues with their thinking. So continued use of alcohol and other drugs may keep youth from advancing to more complex stages of thinking and social interaction. And so when youth have with alcohol use disorders they're shown to perform worse on memory tests and have diminished abilities to plan. So this picture is a 15-year-old boy who doesn't drink and a 15-year-old boy who is a heavy drinker. The teen who has a history of drinking was sober during this activity, and you can see how the non-drinking brain has lit up when they do this memory task, and the drinking brain just can't make the connection. So the parts of the brain are just not as active, which is obviously going to inhibit their school and their learning. So alcohol and development. So this is kind of an overall looking at the picture. So we have talked about memory and learning. So it can inhibit or affect their school attendance, disrupt their concentration. It can damage their relationships either from the family side of things or the friend side of things, and then potentially altering their brain function. So all of these, if you're having issues in the high school, middle school and high school years, you're going to affect your college and your working years. So they talk about this kind of developmental cascade or a snowball effect that can occur that is affecting development, leading to other problems in the course of the development. So this I thought was kind of funny. I thought Casual Friday meant you could show up drunk at work. My bad. So how the alcohol can just lead into their adult life and cause issues. So risk factors for alcohol use. So what's interesting when they talk about risk factors, that the risk factors for alcohol are not strictly for alcohol use. It's risk factors that can predict many other issues. And what they find is that these risk factors are not when you take a 12-year-old out of school and look at him, it's when you look at the 3, 4, and 5-year-olds. So risk factors in the preschool age kids that can predispose to issues later in life include things like temperament differences related to their behavioral and emotional control, problems with their self-awareness and self-monitoring, attention, response inhibition, effort provoke control, and then on the environment side of things, a history of adversity in forms like antisocial behavior, abuse, trauma, other negative life experiences. And so if you see those in a younger child, or if you're talking to a kid who you realize had these issues as a child, then kind of should put up those red flags to think about what they could get themselves into later in life. So these, like I said, could predict alcohol use, but also predict other problems, including conduct and learning disorders, risk-taking behaviors, dropping out of school, early sexual activity, pregnancy, and things like that. Looking more at the risk factors, so the past medical history, they found that when adolescents who have mental health issues like depression or ADHD, those kids are at high risk for substance abuse, as well as those who have faced physical or sexual abuse, like mentioned in the last slide. So their kind of levels for thinking through things are already kind of blunted because they've had to face certain things in their life. And then what's really interesting is that the social history aspect of things. So when it's been noted that youth are more likely to drink alcohol when at least one of their parents has a history of alcoholism or alcohol use. So I don't really know what this picture is. He's feeding his chicken alcohol. So obviously if you're in an environment where alcohol is present, then the inhibitions or the reasons to not drink seem to be much less. This graph kind of reiterates that. So the yellow line on the top is looking at family history positive for alcohol use in relation to the age of first alcohol use. So when the prevalence of family history is very positive around age 13, 14, you can see that 50% of these kids have their first use of alcohol, and then their prevalence of their lifetime dependence diagnosis is pretty high. So 50% in the family history positive group versus the black line, which is about 25%. So their risk is nearly doubled at that young age if they're surrounded by a family history of alcohol issues. So what about protective factors? What kind of keeps these kids from drinking? So school came up in both situations. Is it a risk factor, or is it protective? So it talks about how numerous studies have looked at these teens and if they're doing well in school, so they have good grades, involved in extracurricular activities like sports, participation in academic activities, that is actually protective for them, and they're less likely to engage in underage drinking. However, if they're not in those, the school environment provides them with can provide them with a group of friends who may be drinking, and then can leading to poor grades in those. And so those with poor grades and behavioral problems often tend to connect with other students who are in those situations and may lead them to drink. So this talks about how often versus how much. So if you think of adults who use alcohol, it tends to be, or it can be on more of a daily basis where they'll have multiple drinks in the evening, and then may binge drink on the weekends. Teens don't tend to do that. They tend to binge drink much more often. So if we look at this graph, the yellow lines are the past month use, and the blue lines are binging, and binging is considered 5 drinks or more, which is what they tend to do. So if we pick one of the lines, so like age 16, you can see that about 25% of the kids surveyed in this study had used alcohol in the past month, and then roughly 15% of those had, so more than half of the ones who had said they had used had actually been binge using, which is pretty incredible. So what's interesting is that the teen environment likely fosters this. So teens will go to parties on the weekend, then they go on to college where there's more partying and kind of social interaction, or they go into the military, which has a high rates of drinking as well. So they're just surrounded and kind of plopped into the wrong environment. So why do they drink more? Why don't they just limit themselves to 1 or 2? What studies have found is that they actually have a diminished sensitivity to intoxication. Excuse me. So they can't do research on teens. We can't have a group of teenagers drink alcohol and a group of teenagers not drink alcohol. That is not ethical. So what they do is they look at animals that are comparable. So from animal research, they looked at adults versus adolescent animals, and adolescents have been showing less sensitivity to the negative effects. So they have less of the sedation, less hangover effects, and less loss of muscular coordination. And they have shown more sensitivity to the alcohol effects on social facilitation and disruption of spatial memory. So they kind of, to me, that means that they're able to escape the situation and kind of do what they want to do while they're intoxicated. So if we reflect this back onto the human model, we can conclude that human adolescents may be less sensitive than adults to particular effects of alcohol, and maybe at higher risk for heavier consumption per drinking occasion. So I'm not drunk, I'm in a state of alcohol-induced awesomeness. The last part of this just talks about risky behaviors. So when they're drinking, what happens? So the Youth Risk Behavior Survey was a survey done in 2001 or 2002, looking at what kids are doing. So this slide focuses on heavy drinking and sexual activity. So heavy drinkers are more likely than non-drinkers to have had sexual intercourse at all, to have sex before age 13, to have sex with at least 6 different partners, sex with 3 partners in the past month, and to have used alcohol or drugs prior to their most recent sexual activity. And I didn't go over the numbers, but you can see that they're pretty drastic differences, 87 versus 34, 20 versus 2%. So these kids are doing a lot more risky things with other teens who are likely in the same situation. Many who have engaged in sexual activity while drinking report having unprotected sex, which is a whole different talk of its own. So the outcomes from unprotected sex that could be life-changing depending on what happened. And then this last part was really interesting. So 30% of 15 to 17-year-olds say that they drink even though they know they may have sex when they're intoxicated, and they wouldn't when they're sober. So they go into these situations knowing that if I didn't have a drink, I probably wouldn't get myself in trouble with or have sex with somebody. But if I drink, I'm probably going to do it, which is kind of just astonishing to me that 30% of them realize it. So they have that kind of insight, but they still will go forward. And then, so along with sex, the other risky behavior that was focused on, and that was drinking and driving. So in 2009, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration notes that 5,000 drivers aged 16 to 20 were involved in fatal crashes, and nearly 20% had a blood alcohol concentration over the legal adult limit. So that just kind of can put those two and two together. And then 2001, so that same survey from the previous slide, is noting that 80% of youth who frequently drink report that they had ridden with a driver who had been drinking. So just affects many aspects of their young lives. So in conclusion, just a couple bullet points. So we know that there's rapid changing and development of the brain during the adolescent years. They have this heightened reward system where they're seeking novelties in risky situations. When they seek alcohol in those situations, it affects multiple areas of their brain, as well as their development and full myelination. They drink for various reasons. They often drink much more alcohol in quantity, and they suffer fewer immediate side effects, leading them to kind of further their drinking habits. So overall, this kind of brought to my attention that counseling teens on these issues should be considered at every encounter if possible, just because of the drastic effects that it does have on their developing brain. I think those are my references.